All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is officially noon, and we have a lot to cover today. Really excited to see the turnout. Obviously, a lot of interest in this important topic today. So with that, we will jump right in. We'll be talking today about developing LA's building decarbonization policy. I'm Dave Hodgins. I run the LA Better Buildings Challenge, and it's been really exciting to have been involved in the formulation and rollout of the existing buildings energy and water efficiency ordinance. And what we're talking about today is the evolution of that. So building performance standards are more than a trend. It really is imperative so that we broaden the tent, bring in more people to the conversation about building decarbonization and all of the co-benefits that come with that. So before we start, as always, I want to thank the LA Department of Water and Power for your continued support and leadership of our program, the investments that you're making in the communities, and to make sure that we do have a resilient and clean grid going forward. Couple of housekeeping items. As usual, to keep things orderly, attendee lines will be muted, but we are going to endeavor to save some time at the end for Q&A. So please do type your questions into the chat, and we will read them and direct them to whoever we think is best positioned to respond to those. We will be sending out the recording and the slides by Friday, as usual, along with some key takeaways and resources that we will be covering or touching on during today's discussion. And it will be free-flowing discussion today. So I hope you all find it very engaging. In terms of agenda, we're going to start macro. I'll provide a little bit of context. I will try to keep that brief and get it over to our speakers. I'm really excited about our speakers today. As I mentioned, it's going to be a free-flowing discussion between policymakers and commercial real estate. And we'll be discussing how you can get involved, how you can make sure that your voices are heard and help shape something that's really workable and impactful here. And as I mentioned, we're going to try to save time for Q&A at the end. So please do type your questions into the chat as per usual. So with that, we'll get started. So LA leads on climate. We're feeling the effects already, of course, here with the very weird weather, the wind storms and everything that you're all experiencing in your lives. But LA, in the numbers has also been leading ever since Energy Star existed. LA has been #1. I think we fell to #2 1 year behind Washington, DC, where they've got so many federal buildings that I will argue we're skewing their numbers. So LA, you all have been leaders since the beginning. LA has also been a leader on policy, as I mentioned, with the existing buildings energy and water efficiency ordinance, or EBW as we affectionately call it, went into effect in 2016. And at the time, and I think maybe still is, the most forward-thinking and comprehensive policy of its kind. It includes water, and is looking at action just beyond benchmarking. So again, today's discussion and the policy that's coming down the pike is building on all of that. A lot of this is not new. This has been embedded in LA's Green New Deal, formerly known as the Sustainable City Plan. I'm not going to repeat all of the numbers here, but LA has had a plan for a 1.5C Paris compliant pathway towards zeroing out emissions. And again, with a focus on water, because of course that's a major issue here for us in Southern California, well, throughout the West and the country, as well as delivering on environmental justice and equity and accessibility. That's been a central focus, but as you'll hear today, that remains very much a central focus and really the lens through which the city is approaching this. And our guests from ULI, of course, will have published some great resources on that. And so that will be a big part of what we're talking about today. The numbers, again, have not changed. However, we've seen some great progress in terms of announcements from the city and LADWP, deepening commitments to decarbonize the grid, harden the grid, investments on improving local water, reducing our reliance on imported water significantly, and diverting urban runoff. So this really is comprehensive, and there's a systems thinking here that we're, again, continuing and bringing forward into this next stage of the conversation. So more to the point today, carbon neutrality in existing buildings. Looking backwards from 2050, we can see that we've got some work to do. Now, a lot of you, this is not new. You guys have been making investments, making reductions. 2025 is coming up quickly. Our original goal was 20% by 2020. We've revised that in line with the Sustainable City Plan so that everybody is really singing from the same hymn book. And 2030 and 2035 are going to come up quickly. And as we start to look to decarbonize buildings, to electrify more buildings and end uses, and zero out that which we cannot electrify in other ways, the thinking needs to start today, right? These projects have a long sort of development timeline. It's a big part of what we try to help with, but the time is now. The time is now. 2025 is going to come up very quickly, and 2030 is going to be a blink after that. On the previous slide and others you've seen, a big part of this, of course, depends on the grid, right? It's not possible to zero out energy consumption or demand in buildings, right? They need to perform their function. And in fact, we all are using more and more electricity per capita, as with our devices. And again, as we start to electrify, that's going to be pushing electricity use upwards. And that doesn't even, I didn't even talk about electrification of transportation, which is another huge part for improving air quality and, of course, moving away from fossil fuels. So the LA 100 study, which was released last year, coincidentally on the same day as our innovation awards, is a first of its kind, really, groundbreaking study. And it's more than a study, it's a plan. It's actually a plan that lays out cost-effective pathways to get to zero in LA, and progress is being made. DWP is the #1 off-taker for green hydrogen, for example. They have the largest solar feed-in tariff program in the country, and that's shifting over to more net metering. We're seeing a lot more customers getting involved in that. Demand response program doubling its target this year. So DWP is making huge investments, not to mention the over $100 million that has now been allocated specifically to incentivize retrofits of multifamily affordable housing of all sizes. So investments are being made to make this plan a reality. Low Carbon Leaders is our LABBC's kind of tip of the spear contribution, and I really want to acknowledge the leadership of the folks that are noted here on this slide. We are going to be opening our enrollment window on March 1st, so there will be some more information coming about that. We're going to be looking to recruit 5 more customers into this program, which I'll go into a little bit more detail on that now. So going beyond the 20% by 2020, now our goal 22% by 2025. We're upping that. I'll talk on a future slide or coming up here shortly about our revised targets in collaboration with LADWP, the city, and the US Department of Energy. But net zero retrofits include a few components, right, or a few principles. So obviously efficiency first. Efficiency is the first fuel. It is the most cost-effective means to decarbonize. And it is key, absolutely fundamental to the LA 100 strategy and making this goal of 100% clean energy for 100% of Angelenos cost-effective to achieve. So net zero retrofits also include smartening up our buildings, becoming a grid asset. using low carbon energy supplies. Now, of course, DWP has a huge role to play here, but what is the potential at the building level or at the site level to self-generate, to store energy, to shift loads? This is all part of it. And credits can play a role, right? It's not currently possible with today's technology and space constraints in existing buildings to replace all end uses with all electric options. So what is the role of credible offsets? And we understand that this is a journey, right? This is a different path for every building, but we think there's a lot we can learn, and we're already learning a ton from the collaboration with the folks I showed on the previous slide. So we'll be publishing action plans. That's the main commitment to being involved with the low carbon leaders, is to share your plan. How did you get there? What are the buckets of emissions reduction strategies that are going to get to zero most cost effectively in a way that makes sense? It's a quick plug. As I mentioned, our enrollment window will open March 1st, but here are the basic requirements. A stated public commitment. And again, this is coming from alignment with Paris and city policy, as we're going to get into today, to be net zero by 2050. We'd love to get there a lot sooner than that. We need to get there a lot sooner than that. The wedge analysis is what I referred to. Where are the reductions coming from? What we cannot either generate or reduce through efficiency and load shifting, can we zero out with credible credits? Process transparency, so that we're contributing to the industry. What's working? What are the challenges? What could we not get over? What did we get over, and how did we do it? And that gets published. And the US Department of Energy is collating all of these action plans and creating a library so that folks can look and say, what buildings in here are like mine? What organizations are in here that are like mine? So that I can have some ideas how to get started. And again, we're here to help. I'm very proud of the collaboration with the Urban Land Institute, and we have leadership from both ULI Greenprint and ULI Los Angeles joining us today. But we are collaborating with ULI LA and Greenprint as part of the ULI Global Net Zero Imperative to create a roadmap to zero that's looking at how can we leverage public-private partnerships, local incentives, state incentives, the whole sort of range, city incentives, and so forth, in a cross-sectoral way, multidisciplinary way to get to zero. And there's 7 projects globally, so I'm really excited to be part of that, and sharing and learning with what's happening in other cities. Here in LA, we are doing a place-based approach focusing on Bunker Hill. There's an existing district chilled water plant that sits under Bunker Hill. It's under new ownership, a firm called Centrio that has a phenomenal track record of investing capital. They've already begun doing so here in LA to enable this as a resource. And so just a little, I've been learning a lot more about the history of LA and Bunker Hill in particular as we've gotten into this. So that picture on the left is what Bunker Hill used to look like back in the day when LA was a new city. It was picket fences, little Victorian houses. All of those have since been relocated up the 110, about a mile to Heritage Square. And now it looks like the picture on the right. And hopefully a lot of you have had a chance to enjoy a concert at Walt Disney Concert Hall. I've got tickets for a show in June with my son. The Broad is there. So this area, this part of the city, is also now the Central Business District. It's been through multiple evolutions. Next is decarbonization. So very excited to collaborate with ULI on this. Another key partner is IBI. They're a very active ULI member, architecture firm. Of course, our city partners, the US DOE, LADWP, National Renewable Energy Lab is involved. Arup, a global engineering firm, has stepped up and is donating their expertise to help us model the potential here, both from a carbon perspective and the business case to optimize for carbon intensity, and cost across multiple use types and building typologies to take advantage of differences in load profiles. And of course, Centrio is really central to all of that. They're the operators of the central plant. And there's a big vision to expand the capacity of that plant and even potentially link it up with other plants that exist in downtown and really grow this. And the part that's almost most exciting to me about it is that they've done this before in Chicago and other places. So we have a roadmap to start from, and we'll be working with ULI to do a TAP, a technical assistance panel, which will pull together subject matter experts from all the relevant areas, from finance, legal, real estate, and the other related disciplines to, really look at this opportunity and generate some really impactful recommendations. I'm also very proud to announce that as of last Friday, we have upped our commitment with the US Department of Energy. So we will no longer just be the Better Buildings Challenge. This is the Better Climate Challenge. And the shift here is acknowledging the fact that it's no longer just about efficiency or EUI reductions. As we're looking to decarbonize and electrify, we're going to be seeing electricity use going up, of course. And so we're shifting our metrics to account for that. So more of a GHG focus. Of course, this is the direction that the city is going from a policy perspective. This is the direction that DWP is going in terms of the investments that they're making. And so we're really excited about this shift and look forward to engaging with all of you to recommit around this new goal. And I think this aligns with a lot of what you already are doing. So more to come on this. So with that, I am going to step back and introduce our speakers, and we will get into a discussion about what's happening here at the city. Where are we at? What is the timing, the opportunities to plug into that? Marta Shantz is joining us from ULI Greenprint to go through a really powerful resource that they published on 10 principles for policymakers to bear in mind as they develop these building performance standards. And my friend Marty Borko, Executive Director of ULI Los Angeles, will be joining that discussion as well to talk about our collaboration and work that ULI LA has already been doing and is doing in this area. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to my friend Megan Ross, Climate Advisor to Mayor Garcetti and whoever's coming next.
Thanks so much, Dave. It's great to be here. Yes, I'm Megan Ross. I work with the Mayor's Office of Sustainability and Buildings and Housing Issues. And so Dave gave such a fantastic overview of some of our key Green New Deal goals around buildings and energy. But I want to just emphasize what he shared about the LA 100 study and how that helps us raise ambition across so many of our buildings in the city. Net zero carbon buildings is where the Green New Deal started. Those buildings are highly energy efficient, and typically you see on-site renewable energy that that is greater than or equal to any carbon of energy drawn from the grid. But noticing how our grid and our buildings work so closely, with LADWP's energy grid going fully carbon-free by 2035, that means that so many of our buildings are going to be able to be zero carbon a lot more easily. They still should be highly energy efficient, but it means that on-site renewable energy may or may not be present. If you are fully plugged into an electric grid that is totally carbon-free, congratulations, you're there, you're zero carbon. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities upcoming to think about how do we get as many buildings into that fully zero carbon category as possible. And for those that may have a different pathway to get to net zero, what does that look like? What's the on-site renewable potential? What are the different kinds of ways that buildings can get as far as they possibly can, but especially leaning so much on energy efficiency that saves costs, drives down demand on the grid, makes it easier for everyone to meet our climate goals. And some of the ways that we try to build a pathway toward that, I think are kind of, these 5 elements. Understanding our building stock and how it uses energy is really important. That's the baseline that the EBE ordinance, or the existing building energy and water efficiency ordinance, has given us. Those of you who've been benchmarking your buildings and sharing your energy and water use, thank you. That's exactly what we need to understand how our buildings use energy. And we are just now embarking on the second element of understanding stakeholder priorities and understanding how impacts, what impacts are present when we change our buildings. And pretty soon we'll be down to the next three: analyzing our technical pathways and curves of change, developing a suite of policies and programs, many of which we already have and are building out to decarbonize, and making sure that the whole time we're designing for maximizing the best impacts, to make sure that our change is feasible and to have an eye toward implementation. How is this going to work for building owners and managers, for building users, and for the city that's implementing the policy. So there have been two recent council actions that some of you may have heard of, but that's really why we're here. And I'm so glad that the timing of this, today's webinar kind of like is, looking toward a couple of events that are coming up and that are still being planned. But 3 months ago, City Council stated that they really wanted to see an inclusive stakeholder engagement process around building decarbonization, to understand what were the priorities of the communities of Angelenos across varying interests, and to think about what kinds of impacts we want to maximize and what kind of impacts we might want to avoid in decarbonizing our buildings. And so 3 departments are being asked by council to host these stakeholder engagement processes. They're happening this spring, and following those departmental processes, council will receive reports of what did stakeholders say, what's important, what are we trying to achieve here, what are the particular ways that we can achieve our goals. And then just a few weeks ago, City Council specified a particular policy goal for new buildings. You really want to see zero carbon operational emissions in new building construction by 2030. And so they've asked the Department of Building and Safety to draft a policy informed by that stakeholder process and submit it by the end of this year. So that makes 2022 a really big year for decarbonizing buildings, a really big year for all of you to get involved, because drawing on the output of that stakeholder process, council is going to name additional policy goals with particular attention to equity, climate impacts, and implementation issues. And thank you so much to Anvi for putting those motions in the chat if anybody's interested. So these 3 departments are where we're going to see stakeholder engagement this spring. The first one, the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, they've already started. They had their charge ahead of time. Perfect, this is the right slide. They had their charge ahead of time, and so just next month, they're hosting a Climate Equity LA series. It is really geared toward understanding the impacts to frontline communities and to justice-oriented community organizations, particularly thinking about housing affordability impacts and workers in impacted industries, how to handle the transitions of those workers, and how to emphasize and really leverage job creation that's going to come with decarbonizing and retrofitting our buildings. That's already on track, but there's 2 other department policy or processes that are going to come up in the spring. The first is with the Department of Building and Safety. That's really going to be geared toward the real estate community, many of the folks on this call, those in the architecture, engineering, and construction space, building owners and managers, et cetera. And we'll really talk about technical foundations and compliance pathways and a lot of implementation needs. The housing department really felt strongly about holding their own engagement process, particularly with the housing community. So they're going to be speaking with multifamily housing providers, landlords and tenants, and especially those in the affordable housing space, covering some of the same technical topics, of course, some of the same implementation needs, but really thinking more critically about how this affects housing supply and housing protections, how we can ensure that this transition to zero carbon buildings and a climate or carbon neutral city is done so in a way that's sensitive to building owners and managers, keeps people in housing, and all of that.
Thank you, Megan, for that context. So now we'll get into the meat of today's discussion, and I'd like to introduce Marta Shantz with the ULI Greenprint Foundation to walk us through the 10 principles that they've published in a fantastic resource that we'll put in the chat and the follow-up. Again, the 10 principles for policymakers to understand as they develop policies like this. Marta.
Awesome. Thanks, David, and happy to be here. Again, everyone, my name is Marta Shantz. I'm the Senior Vice President with ULI's Greenprint Center for Building Performance, and really happy to be here. A little background on ULI, just to level set. ULI, or the Urban Land Institute, we're a real estate industry group, global, with over 45,000 individual members. And our mission is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. So it's a pretty wide remit when it comes to land use and real estate. And Greenprint, which is the team that I run, is part of ULI's research centers and initiatives. And we focus specifically on climate mitigation. So making that business case for green buildings by tying reductions in carbon emissions to increases in asset value. And so we cover topics ranging from city and real estate climate policy like today, to sustainable tenant fit outs, to net zero, to embodied carbon, and truly everything in between. So the report that's on the slide here is called Decarbonizing the Built Environment, 10 Principles to Unite the Public and Private Sectors on Climate Mitigation Policies for Buildings. And as David mentioned, this is really a culmination of a handful of convenings that we brought together city climate policymakers and real estate sustainability leads to talk through what works when it comes to passing successful climate policy. We also partnered with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network to make sure we had a pretty comprehensive view from that city side of things. And after those 3 workshops, we ended up with 3 key takeaways that are here on the slide and worth me just saying out loud so that you're all on the same page with me. The greater the collaboration between public and private sector, the greater the overall value a building can gain. It really does come down to that business case and the importance of the collaboration. And additionally, that second bullet, no matter the stage of a city's progress or policy development, real estate has a role to play. We think about this in LA, buildings comprise 43% of total carbon emissions. And so with that is a huge percentage. And real estate not only has a responsibility, but an opportunity to be smart about its role in addressing climate change. And then lastly, we think about why this is all happening. And a lot of this is in line with the Paris Climate Accord goals and beyond, where these buildings are very necessary to have policies in order for cities to try and address their overall carbon emissions and that they're responsible for. I mean, if you think about it, the last thing we want is for a city to set climate goals and then policies to meet them that have to do with buildings decarbonizing, and then have the buildings community just, not comply or ignore them because they weren't bought into the process and they weren't involved in the creation of the policies themselves. That's the lose-lose scenario that no one wants. And so this resource here, this 10 principles document, is one way to start addressing that and really bring together the real estate and city policy community across the globe, and especially in the US. Oh gosh, we've got let's go through all of these 5 clicks. Thank you. So I wanted to set the stage a little bit just in terms of a bigger picture around where climate policies are today and how they've matured over the past decade. A little bit of level setting again, because LA has done a lot of progress and it's useful to put it all in context. Local climate policies are where we're seeing a lot of accelerated action on building decarbonization. We're not seeing as much national leadership, and so localities are really stepping up, and they have been for the past decade plus. And it started on the left here with benchmarking ordinances. And today we've got dozens and dozens of localities passing varying public and private disclosure policies around energy benchmarking and water benchmarking, like Megan mentioned with the EBEWE and beyond, which really sets a foundation for having the data and having an understanding of making sure you can manage what you measure. From there, we started seeing cities evolve to do a little more with required building tune-ups or audits or equipment upgrades. And so just for a couple examples, Seattle and Philly both have some tune-up programs. New York City has an audit and retro commissioning mandate. And they also have some sub-metering requirements. I know LA has some pieces involved in the EBEWE as well. So, this was kind of next in that evolution. And from there, we started seeing grades, which hasn't picked up too much across the country, but seems to be influential where it has. And the two places we've seen that so far are in Chicago. They have an energy rating system with stars, kind of like the Chicago flag. And in New York City, they also have letter grades in the lobby of buildings to show how efficient an asset is based on its energy performance. And so that transparency, that amount of very public disclosure of performance is starting to make a difference when we think about different stakeholders pushing for more sustainable performance of buildings. From there, we start thinking about carbon emission caps and performance standards. And this is just growing exponentially right now. Many of you may have seen the White House started a coalition recently, which Megan, if you can nod, yes, LA is a part of, I thought so, to bring together localities and states to drive more building performance standards in a collaborative way. And so some of the cities that have already done this so far include New York City with their local law 97, Washington, D.C. and St. Louis have building energy performance standards. Boston recently passed one. Denver is looking at Seattle. There are so many that have started and many more to come. And so that coalition is just one example of bringing together different stakeholders to drive a very cost-effective and important method to reduce carbon emissions in buildings. And then lastly, a lot of these bullets have been around existing buildings, but it is important to also think about new construction. And we're seeing a lot of leadership there too, where localities and states are setting net zero new construction requirements, all electric new construction requirements. And some of those are starting to bleed over into the existing building side of things too. So it's quite interesting to see how this evolution has gone over time. And I can say very confidently that the most successful ones are the ones that had the building stakeholders involved from the beginning, which is a lovely transition to start talking about these principles. So the first principle, and I'm going to tee it up, and then I think everyone's going to chime in for a solid discussion. So the first principle, and we can tap the slide one more time for the example to show too, is all about calculating a baseline and setting interim and aspirational goals from there. Because if you just kind of pick a goal out of thin air, it loses its structure, it loses its solidity. And so setting ambitious and meaningful data-backed targets is very important, with clear definitions and clear metrics so that everyone's on the same page about what's involved there. And you'll note that across these 10 principles, a lot of this is what cities can do because they are setting the policies. But we also recognize, especially from ULI's perspective, that real estate has a role every single part of these principles. And so from real estate side of things, they need to be measuring their performance, tracking portfolio energy and greenhouse gas performance, setting their own baselines, benchmarking over time to really set that foundation.
I think an important point to touch on here, for this audience is that these are LA's best buildings, right? These are the buildings that have been leaders, that are leaders, and have been reducing. And the incremental cost of driving down energy use often goes up. There can be an opportunity to tunnel through, right, if you're willing to invest enough. But I think that it's an important point that folks who have been tracking their reductions over time and have been keeping good records, that's recognized as part of the policymaking process. Because I think, and Megan, jump in here, a big part of the intent here is to broaden the tent and bring in more of the buildings that have not been paying attention, have not been making these types of investments.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we just are so grateful that there are so many incredible climate leaders here in Los Angeles that are driving this forward and are really showing the way. And I think that, to really see a carbon neutral city, to see a climate forward city, yeah, we will have to bring everyone along. And that's the emphasis that City Council is making, that the mayor has made on inclusivity, around understanding, those who have the deepest and hardest impacts of climate change in those frontline communities. But we do have a lot of great information at our fingertips already, from the benchmarking ordinance that we have We have multiple years of good data that tells us a lot about how our buildings in Los Angeles are doing. And because that's using the Energy Star portfolio manager, which is also connected to this national network of buildings, we can understand not just how LA's best buildings are performing, but how they stack up across that range of less resourced, better resourced buildings, to make sure that we're crafting a policy using data that's contextualized across the entire spectrum.
Yeah, this might be a good time to talk a little bit about, as we now focus on Los Angeles, and Marta's kind of given a great broad perspective on kind of at a national level, but she really talks about the important role that the real estate community plays. And so for ULI LA, I mean, that's really our opportunity and focus. This doesn't happen with any one organization or one city. It's really a collaborative effort between organizations. And it's one of the things that we're very focused on in ULI Los Angeles, is to actually bring those real estate resources to not just Los Angeles, but all 88 cities in our region, because it's really going to be an effort that's a region-based one that all the cities together are going to need to work forward to. And so that idea of engagement of the real estate community is the real role that ULI Los Angeles is trying to play, both with our TAP work and our relationships with Megan and the city, and with David and LABBC and all of those that make it up. The other part of the focus that I think is really important, to two other issues to make sure we keep top of mind, are the issues of social equity and the impacts this has on our communities, and as we move forward with these ideas of doing that, to keep in mind the impacts on social equity in our communities and how that plays out, which really leads to this notion of making sure we engage with the capital markets and where the resources are coming from and where capital is, and making sure that the people that represent capital that help build these buildings and retrofit them have an understanding of that kind of holistic point of view. So that's kind of where we're trying to focus in ULI Los Angeles, is to be what we do best as conveners, and bring those people together around all that kind of myriad of issues that are going to make this kind of move forward.
Marty, I want to pick up on a couple of things that you said there, because there's a lot of really important points. But the first was just coordination with other cities. LA is 88 cities, and a lot of the owners that we work with don't think in terms of utility territories, or it's LA, right? And so I just wanted to underline that and note that other cities in LA have already started on this. West Hollywood has already passed a building performance standard. Santa Monica is itching to do one. And we're in contact with them already. LABBC is, and opening up that dialogue. And so I think that's going to be a great, outgrowth of our collaboration, here focusing in Bunker Hill. But what are we learning, and how can this coordinate with other cities, and how should it be different? I mean, Megan had a great addition to one of my slides that I skipped over by accident, which is that the city of LA has 3 different climate zones within it. If you look at the valley is very different than the west side, is very different than the east side, right? And also in terms of building stock, right? West Hollywood has a lot of, and who's involved, who are the players? West Hollywood, it's a lot of more mom and pop owners, a lot of historic buildings, right? Santa Monica doesn't have the types of, million square foot skyscrapers that we have in downtown. So I think that's a really important point. And we also Megan touched on benchmarking data quality, and Marta did. And having been very involved in helping customers to figure out how to benchmark, and studying the data ourselves as we mine that for insights, it's not perfect, right? There's a good, there's really good compliance rate. COVID, of course, threw that off. But there are gaps. People forgot to put in water. You see way too many perfect hundreds in a lot of the multifamily properties. So that also informs the kind of outreach and engagement that we need to be doing. And I'm excited to be working with you guys to do that. I'm receiving
perfect tee up for that
on.
second slide. We can do one more tap. And because Dave, you mentioned the stakeholders and pulling folks in, that's exactly what we see as a really best practice and in principle when it comes to these partnerships between the public and private sector for successful climate policy. When you say it out loud, it sounds so obvious, but engaging stakeholders early and often and throughout the entire process, the policy development, the policy creation, the implementation, it makes a really big difference when folks can provide meaningful input and ensure that not only are the potential policies achievable, but also that awareness is covered and that there's potential support for these policies as well through all that engagement. So this is very much a two-way street where the city is going to try and engage as much as possible. Real estate also does need to come to that table and participate and share.
Yeah, we're absolutely eager for that. And I think that that's why City Council has tried to structure this in the way that they have. They didn't just come right out and say, we want a BPS with this date and this level and da-da-da-da. They said, we need to engage. We got to talk to people. We need to talk to a broad spectrum of folks who use, own, manage, et cetera, buildings in the city. And then once we have that information, then the policymakers can, take another step and say, okay, well, here's what we do next. Okay, here's what we do next. So, but Marta, you're right. We really do want folks to come to that table, and there'll be instructions at the end of the webinar about how to do that. But I'm really, really happy for what we're doing today and getting a chance to talk through these principles and also to just get the word out and get people excited about what's coming.
And I think an important one here is this role for real estate, participate in working groups. I was very, involved in the early, stakeholder engagement, all of it on EBWE, and folks are busy, and getting people to come to City Hall, take half a day and come do that is hard. And so, I wanted to maybe put it to Megan to talk, if you can at this stage, about plans to try to get out and meet people where they are, because everybody's so busy. How do we make sure that we don't miss the opportunity here?
Yeah, I was just about to share in the chat that, virtual meetings are such a great byproduct of something we've really learned to do well in the last couple of years. And I've noticed that just really democratizes engagement, because you're not fighting traffic or trying to, time the metro, right, to get to City Hall. It's not centrally focused. Like, we can go and be where you are. I mean, you are where I am right now, as an example. I'm not in the office, I'm working from home, like so many of us are. We're in hybrid spaces. And so I think that's where the city is going to lean, is looking for virtual engagement options, and then thinking about where virtual doesn't work. Is there another option, to be in person possibly? But so much of what we're doing for safety reasons as well, for COVID safety reasons, are virtual. So I hope that is going to be useful for folks.
And Marta, I wonder if any other cities you're aware of have used like surveys or other ways that people can at least make their voices heard. And I love surveys because I don't like doing them, but I do try to, because you can get data, right? These live meetings are great, or virtual meetings, but it's hard to capture all of what people are saying. And when we can, a well-crafted survey can help really like crystallize the feedback. I wonder if any other cities have done that, or if there's anything that we could learn and consider here.
I mean, it's really all about the all of the above approach when it comes to stakeholder engagement. Hosting things at City Hall, going to where the real estate or other buildings stakeholders are, so that they don't have to schlep over, or continuing virtual, as you mentioned, Megan. Surveys are also a useful tool. Other things are like farmers markets, tables, and there are so many different ways to engage folks, whether it be a formal event or a survey or a more ad hoc type of engagement. That just the more engagement, the better. Another tricky piece when it comes to building policies in specific is that city policymakers are not real estate experts, and real estate experts are not city policy experts. And so there is this a bit of a chasm when it comes to just understanding the business side of these different players involved. in who's being affected by the policies and what their impacts will be. And so it's really important that, that the city try and calculate the impact of these policies and what they can have on the real estate sector to understand the level of effort for compliance and the economic impact for compliance as well. But then it's also important for the real estate to help with that education, share the economic impacts, talk through what this means for them, but also the benefits, right? There are a lot of positive sides of climate policies as well. And so just thinking about the economic impact to the building sector and what that means for their business is something that's important to incorporate too.
Great. I was about to prompt Marty to talk about how we're studying this as part of our collaboration and the net zero imperative, but I'm also noticing that we're going way long on time, so I think we need to pick up our pace here a little bit. I apologize, but I think we should probably move on and move a little more quickly through these. Yeah.
Okay, I'll be faster on this one. And this is something that LA is doing a really nice job on, is thinking about aligning with the larger policy ecosystem. Because as much as me on our green building research team cares about the green buildings, there are so many co-benefits and other pieces in play, whether that be equity or affordable housing or just other considerations that that are priorities for the city and the policymakers to tie in and think about that larger policy ecosystem to make the policies as efficient and comprehensive as possible.
Totally agree. Just want to emphasize that, a real holistic approach to climate action in buildings is not a one and done code. It's really a comprehensive approach across a bunch of different sectors that integrate, and absolutely, Philadelphia, like many cities in many states, needs to work with their state government. LA is no different. We're already collaborating with the state to make sure we understand what's the procedure for compliance and what's the underlying framework that we can use to best position ourselves for success.
Mm-hmm. On the next principle, we'll keep moving along. And this is looking at additional social and economic goals. So not just looking at the state level or the national level, even for the larger policy landscape, but looking hyper locally to what the priorities are, so that the co-benefits and other positive aspects of addressing climate change can be incorporated.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot about that from our frontline communities already, and some of the pre-engagement that we've done, and the the relationships that I've built across our social justice organizations and housing justice organizations. People are craving clean energy. They just can't wait for it, and they want housing equity, and they want good access to jobs. They want transitional opportunities. So there's a range of benefits and a lot of opportunity there. And I think that what the city departments could really learn from the real estate community is, what do those mean for you? What does that mean for building owners and managers? What's valuable, to you? That's something I really hope to get out of the stakeholder process.
Awesome. This next principle that we have is all about being comprehensive. So subjecting that all the buildings, public and private, in a city will follow this different new ordinance, and think about how that collaboration and impact can work in a way for everyone, whether it's cross-subsidizing capital improvements or thinking about how financial incentives can support those who have more of a burden when it comes to efficiency improvements. There are a lot of different nuances, but being comprehensive and making sure that all buildings can improve their carbon emissions is a very important piece of that puzzle to address decarbonization.
I totally agree. And I think that different categories, different types, sizes, shapes, uses have really different pathways. And we need to account for that, understand it, so that we are enabling everyone to be ambitious in a way that's feasible for them too.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that often gets a lot more attention when we think about this next principle is it's like new construction. So shiny, so exciting, so obvious and in your face with all those construction cranes. But global stats say that 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 have already been built. And so prioritizing existing buildings and improving the sustainability of those, decarbonizing, is a huge, huge piece of the puzzle that is important to be incorporated into climate policy. Clearly, LA is doing a lot on that.
I totally agree. Yeah, I think that's really where the gains that we need are still to be had, is among our existing building stock, and understanding the intricacies there, and creating feasible and ambitious pathways. Yeah.
Yeah, and this engagement, showing up and sharing, what has been working, to the cost effectiveness point, the economic impact point. As we're asking people to go further, what's technically feasible, what have we already looked at that the city can be aware of, as well as on the previous principle, looking at what's been done in municipal buildings, what's the cost effectiveness there, right? So that this is really workable for people.
Absolutely. Speaking of it being workable, I mean, there is an important level of flexibility that needs to be included. So when Megan was talking about pathways for different buildings, we want, ideally, we want to see the requirements simplified enough for everyone in the industry to understand, but also have enough pathways where compliance is feasible for different building types and improves participation. So it's a real balance to master. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is important. And so, from real estate side of things, being able to communicate that, but also, interpret those compliance pathways and incorporate them into the capital plan so that they can comply on a timeline that works for them, is another important piece to make it all success.
And I'm not, I know I keep mentioning credits, and I'm not a fan of credits, but it is true, like I said, that it's not possible to get to zero through efficiency and self-generation in most buildings, especially large high rises. And so, credits are going to play a role. And I hope that that's part of the conversation about how do we zero out, and those credits need to be real, not these very tenuous types of credits that we hear very criticized. There are new models that are really getting at the issues. And so I think, part of the flexibility here, I hope we'll consider that, or purchase of green power, right? Or power purchase agreements to zero out emissions in a way that is, again, technically feasible, right?
I've seen lots of cities tackle that issue in their policies, and it's something I really expect to come up and generate robust conversation in our processes. And I'll just share one example of flexibility that I've seen in New York City. This mentions DC, which they have a great policy too, but I'm thinking about New York because they also are tracking carbon emissions. That's the metrics that they're trying to hone in on. It's the exact same for Los Angeles. We really care about your carbon emissions. This is a climate policy, and that has so many other effects as well. But the way that New York handled it for their largest buildings is they said, for many buildings, this is what we're tracking. It's the emissions level that we want to see go down. But for some building types, for some building categories, you can choose to implement specific performance measures instead of following an emissions pathway. And that was New York's way of saying some buildings are going to have trouble meeting this level, or some buildings, have structural issues, or they're a different vintage, or they have different end uses. And so they need to follow ECMs instead of following a curve. And that was their way of providing flexibility for that sector. I thought that was a helpful model, and that came out of their engagement processes as well, that uplifted that concern, from that subsector that said, this is a different way that we want to see, change happening in our buildings.
The next one we have as one of our 10 principles is about fostering a marketplace of support. And I swear, just the example that we feature when we talk about these is the LA Better Buildings Challenge. I'm not trying to brown nose here, but it's really valuable to have a central hub where all of the resources can be convened in one location to support education and technical assistance, financing opportunities. I'm seeing some of that in the chat, and training to identify all the opportunities for improvement and innovation for buildings. Those resources generally are extremely disparate, just across the board, hard to find. And so, if the city can put together some sort of strategy for a hub or a marketplace of support, and importantly, real estate actually take advantage of that, like that's what we want to see.
Yeah, you touched on financing, and I know we're close to time, but it's an area where we had focused a lot in the past. The different models that have kind of come and gone and are now coming back, and new tools in the toolkit with on-bill options as well. And so we are very focused in the process of creating a new financing platform, which will feature best-in-class providers. So think whoever's speaking at the ACEEE Finance Conference, you'll see them appear as part of this directory, and then our team will be available to help folks sift through the different options, right? And think through what's most appropriate for their property, their project, their objectives, and will facilitate those introductions. So that's something that we'll be talking about on an upcoming webinar, and something that's in process now, because we're talking bigger numbers now than when we're looking at the low-hanging fruit, in large part has been harvested, at least by the folks tuned in today. So we look at deep decarbonization. We're talking, again, bigger dollar amounts, longer time horizons, and financing is going to be a really important part of that. Not to mention folks in disadvantaged communities and others who are challenged to access capital. They don't have the same type of capital markets access that most of our LABBC partners do.
All right, and then the last one we have here, and we'll even have a couple minutes for Q&A, I think, is around just when we think about the long-term performance of these policies, ensuring compliance by rewarding success and accelerating transformation across the built environment. I mean, having meaningful but scaled penalties for non-compliance certainly is a stick that we have seen work. But also, I mean, those carrots are so valuable too, recognizing and rewarding achievements, whether it's a photo with the mayor or some sort of plaque in your lobby. There are a lot of ways that that make it a little easier to encourage the building sector to comply with these new policies. And so not only do they need to understand the cost of non-compliance, but the value of complying and what it means for them.
Thanks, Marta. And we do have a couple more slides on ways to get involved before we get to some Q&A. And I'm free to go a little bit longer if you all are. If anyone needs to drop off, we will be capturing all of the questions, and we'll make sure that we address those in follow-up. And again, this is just the start, right? This is the start of a process. So if you read the motion that was shared through the chat, and I see that Megan is unfortunately not able to stay on, so I think we'll have to do our Q&A and follow-up. But again, this is the start of a process. So LA Department of Building and Safety and LA Housing Department will be the leads on outreach. So make sure that you sign up. We gotta show up, make your voice heard, claim your seat, however you want to think about it, so that your voice is heard as part of this. It's very, very important. So the link was provided through the chat. We will be doing lots of follow-up on this. So if we don't get to questions today, it's not the last opportunity. A big focus of this, or the lens through which the city is approaching this, is around equity and accessibility, right? And so the newly formed Climate Emergency Mobilization Offices, or CEMO, is beginning a series of community engagement meetings. And it's also education about why decarbonize homes in Los Angeles. A lot of folks are still feeling, I think we all are, a pretty serious hangover. We haven't gotten past COVID, right? Still here. And all of the economic pain that's come with that. And especially for folks in low-income communities, climate is not at the top of their priority list. There are pressing, first-order problems that need to be addressed before we can get to decarbonization. And that's something that I've really learned through the outreach we've been doing over the last 18 months as we begin to develop these financing options and new program delivery mechanisms. What are the other services? What's the other support that's needed to get at the decarbonization opportunities? So I think this is a really important part of the effort, and want to applaud the city for thinking about this. And a final plug for LABBC. Enrollment window opens March 1st, be open through the end of April. And this is the opportunity to get involved. We'd love to hear from you. Again, with our existing partners, we'll be reaching out to you to talk about the Better Climate Challenge and recommitting around that. And again, I think this is consistent with what most of you are already doing. And maybe it's a nudge to help get to that public net zero commitment. But that public commitment is important, right? We need to create positive accountability loops, become a low carbon leader, join a cohort of folks in your industry, whether that's office or entertainment or multifamily residential, industrial, that are dealing with the same issues. And we will provide support to help you get there and access the various DWP and other incentives that are available to help buy down the cost, work on financing, work on technical challenges, and provide that connectivity to the city. So do get involved. This is, again, it's becoming more and more mandatory, and I'm sure you're already hearing it from your investors and lenders. So we're here to help. And we want to share success. I mean, there's a lot of wins. Like LA, you guys have been leading for decades on this. And so we've been doing our innovation awards now, coming on 8 years. This will be the 8th annual. And so we want to hear what have you been doing? And I think most of you are familiar with the categories for that. But again, all of this, whether it's joining the LABBC for the first time, getting involved in a net zero retrofit and publishing how you're going about that through Low Carbon Leaders, and sharing what you've already done through the awards, we want to hear from you. With that, I think we'll wrap up. I'm sorry we did not have time for Q&A, but we are just at 1 o'clock. And I will conclude with a quote from one of my favorite authors. I've been reading a lot these days with my kids, from Horton Hears a Who. A person is a person, no matter how small. So I think this really resonates for me with the equity focus, moving at the speed of trust, and making sure that, this really is an inclusive process for all. So thank you all for joining. We will be getting the slides and materials and everything out, and we will look forward to engaging with you all as we kick off this process. Thank you.